Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the track titled Smart City Priorities. What's next? I'm your host, Kikuzawa, from the Center of Livable Cities. Please take a seat as we'll be starting now. During this event, we would like to remind all of you to keep your mask on. Please set your phones and beeping devices to silent mode. In accordance with the Personal Data Protection Policy, it is our duty to inform you that this session will be recorded. If you feel unwell, please approach anyone with an organizer badge. During the session, we invite the audience to pose questions using the program Slido. To do this, please scan the QR code on the screen. Without further ado, please welcome our moderator, Ms. Ng Wee Wei, Country Managing Director and Senior Managing Director of Accenture Singapore, and our esteemed panelists, Mr. Jacques Gauthorn, Vice President of Cities and Public Services, Dassault Systems, France, Mr. Cheng Kai Fong, Second Permanent Secretary, Smart Nation Digital Government of Singapore, Mayor Michal Kovat, Mayor of Tallinn, Estonia, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Member of Economic Advisory Council to Prime Minister of India and Secretary of Government, Professor Louis Betancourt, Professor and Director of Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, University of Chicago, and finally, Mr. Chiu Men Long, President of Urban Solution, ST Engineering, Singapore. Over to our moderator, Ms. Ng, please.
A very good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this early morning. I have with me a very esteemed panel. I'm really looking forward to this morning's discussion. And they come from practitioners, as well as academia, as well as the mayor. So we will have a lot of perspectives, and I think you will hear from everyone a different definition of smart cities, where hopefully together we build a new body of knowledge on this. So thank you, Kai Fong, Sanjeev, Mayor Kolvat, Louis, Man Leong, and Jack for joining us on the panel on smart cities. I believe most would agree that the pandemic has changed the way we live, work, and play in a city. It has not only brought about accelerated digital transformation across various industries, but also societal shifts, such as hybrid work and the urgent need to transition to clean energy and responsible consumption. In addition, the notion of data ownership and trust will continue to evolve as technologies enable experiences to transcend from physical to the virtual world, and therefore establishing transparency and trust will be key as cities evolve to balance citizen expectations, privacy needs with innovation and integrated experiences. Cities will also need to ensure that all segments of the population are included, right, both now and in a mixed reality world. So the impetus is really for cities and businesses to take action now to transform and create cities that are even more livable, sustainable, and resilient. With that, I would actually like to pose the first questions to everyone on this panel. Right? With the emergence of a multipolar world, the climate change, and of course, the involving technologies, how do you see these forces shaping the role of cities today? And what opportunities and challenges do you foresee? Perhaps I start with Kai Fong first at the end. Did I give you a shot?
I thought you might start with the mayor first, who actually runs an actual city rather than a bureaucrat.
We'll go from end to end. How's that? Yeah.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just make a short comment about how it has changed cities, or the way we think about cities. The way I think about cities is that we first must start with the human rather than with infrastructure. And I think what has happened in the pandemic, and actually it's not just a pandemic, right, but the whole series of geopolitical events, climate change and all that, has led to a loss of trust in government. You see that across the board. Edelman Trust Barometer, for example, puts it, trust in government as below 50%, average is about 45%. And many people don't trust government to do most things right. In fact, I think 15% of people do that. So there's a serious trust issue. But on top of the trust issue for governments, I think there's also a serious trust issue on just the role of markets itself. Certain skepticism about markets, the inflationary pressures, wage stagnation in different cities don't help. And if you just bring that together, I think it forces us to really rethink what makes a city. Many of us are responsible for the smart cities movements in our own respective countries. A lot of it is driven by the desire to create more economic opportunities for people, to make our lives better, whether it's in terms of play and in terms of living. But actually, we got to get down to the fundamental problem first. It's never the technology first. It always has to start with the human. It's never just the infrastructure and the roads. You can't overplan things, so you have to find that balance between what you call planning and intentionality versus having some sort of an emergent approach. So I'll just put that as a problem. No one really has a solution here, but it's a problem that we are grappling with. And we think that technology can play a role. Just very briefly, we've always focused on making our cities more livable. And then another dimension is to make our city more smart. But I think one missing dimension is about making our city more human. And if you bring that all together, you ask ourselves, how do we make our city more livable? How do we make that connection between our citizens, as well as the connection and attachment between our citizens and the place that they live in? So that's what some of the things we are thinking about in Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you. Sanjeev, do you would like to add to that?
Sure. India has a fairly large smart cities program, which was started about 5 odd years ago. And after some initial hiccups, it's got going. And the key thing here is that it was not defined as something digital necessarily, although some people did use the program to create command and control centers in certain cities. But this program was defined in a different way. And since complexity theory is one of the themes of this conference, let me say that it was heavily intellectually derived from complexity theory. In the first of all, the idea was to create strange attractors that would encourage various kinds of multipliers and emergent behavior. It was explicitly stated that different cities were expected to do things that are contextual and decentralized to their context, and so on. And we have had some outcomes. Not every one of those outcomes are positive, but I'll give you some examples of things that have worked so far. There's a city called Indore, which is in central India. Till about 3 years ago, it was a fairly messy industrial city, like many other rapidly growing cities. Got a lot of chemical factories and those kinds of things in it. So that was what it was known for. Historically, it's also been known for good food, but what it was known for now is for being a messy industrial town. And what the municipal commissioner there did was to focus on essentially cleaning up the garbage and the littering. So a huge program has been put in place in that city, and it has been dramatically cleaned. I mean, I went there about 6 months ago, and I couldn't recognize the place at all because same buildings were just cleaner. And because it's cleaner, many other things began to be triggered. So, for example, local households began to take greater pride in the way their houses look. So they began to paint it up. A lot of open food areas began to open out in areas on the streets and so on. And so another smart city project that was attempted was that since it was famous for food, the city, they've taken a fairly longish road and pedestrianized it and turned into a food road. So since we are in Singapore, there's a glutton alley. Just imagine that in 10 times the size, and it's open till very early into the morning, packed with people. And so there are all these multipliers that have come from this. Similarly, we are now intervening in all kinds of places. For example, there's a city you may be all familiar of called Varanasi. It's one of the oldest cities in the world, very famous for its temples and the ghats along the river. And again, a big effort under the Smart City project to clean it up. but also interestingly, actually to revive certain areas around key temples. Now again, different. The intervention that we did was different from what traditional conservation would have done. Traditional conservation would have gone there and tried to conserve the old buildings as best as they could, paint them up and so on. That's usually what happens. But in fact, what was done here was tearing down some fairly old buildings to open up spaces and so on. As I said, controversial, but I think now that it's been done, a lot of people understand what's happening. And again, you can see the smartness of it came from the design, but also an understanding on complexity as an adaptive system, and understanding that even an old precinct is not reached its peak. We too are a part of the chain of time, and we too can add things as long as it sort of generally fits with the ambience of the place and adds. So all of these things have been done. So smartness in the way we have defined it is related to sort of these multiplicative and feedback loops and immersions. Those are the kinds of ways we have thought about smartness.
Yeah, a bit of what the city stands for and how the residents relate to it, and
Yes.
yet not be shackled by what, like I said, conservation should mean, and look for innovation within that.
Yes.
That's a very interesting sharing. And Mayor, now I'll come to you from Asia to Estonia. What's your perspective on this?
Yes, thank you. So I think COVID showed us that cities are more prepared for the crisis than states, but we don't have sometimes enough resources for it. So in the future, we see that decision making have to move back to the cities. Actually, for Europe, it is a historical process because history of state in Europe began from the cities. And yes, and actually before the COVID, we had in Europe quite huge discussion about decision making in cities and more resources from the European Union to cities and more possibilities to decide. Now we see that during the crisis, cities were more faster, more operative, and I have to say that also maybe better decisions, the decisions from the state. So, but we talk now that we are talking about those challenges and at the same time opportunities what we have because of COVID, because COVID boosted digitalization. But in the same time, we have different crises. And not crises one after one. We have crises at the same time. And those crises reduce the process of digital transformation. And inflation, economical crisis, war in Europe. And now we have to understand that cities must to be prepared for the crisis, because the crisis, it is a new reality. It is a new reality and it is our future, actually. And this preparedness doesn't depend from the type of crisis. So we talk about the decision-making process, we talk about the structure, we talk about the communication, and we talk about the technologies. So if we have technologies, if we have data, we are prepared for the crisis. And this preparedness is not depends from the type of crisis. And I see that in Europe, but actually this is the global situation. Crisis, it is a global situation, not only in Europe. So, and if we understand that cities have bigger role when we face those crises, So we have to be more prepared. And this is one more motivation if we talk about transformation, digital transformation and green transformation. And one more idea. So in this conference and in all other conferences, we talk very often about different areas of transformation, of green transformation, for example. We talk about the energy, we talk about the greenhousing, we talk about recycling, but what we need, what the cities need, for my opinion, they need holistic conception to create synergy between different topics, between different technologies. Of course, one possibility is big data, but we have, for my opinion, to create a holistic conception for the future. And for example, Tallinn is the European Green Capital next year, 2023. So, and one of our idea to create international competence center for creating a holistic conception of green transition. Thank you.
Thank you. So Kai-Fong mentioned this and you mentioned this, which is COVID-19 actually exposed or re-examined the relationship between citizens and government and probably established some new expectations of public service. And at the core of this is actually cities and the resilience and responsiveness in cities in managing that public life. And I think what you brought out is also a very interesting point, which is from a technology perspective, there is a role because in order to be responsive, you do need data, you do need technologies. At the same time, whilst you want bottom-up initiatives to come up, there's also a role to play at the organizational level so that things become synergistic, right? And there's a holistic coordination across the initiatives. So with that, I'm going to ask the question to Luis because I know you've been studying this area for a long time. You've seen the evolution, and maybe what's your perspective now?
Sure, thank you, Wei. It's great to be here. Thank you for being here early in the morning. So I'm an academic, a professor at the University of Chicago, and I run an institute on studying cities and urbanization using scientific methods. So what that means is that we try to understand fundamentally how cities work. What are the processes that make them up, and how do they change? And from that perspective, there are a few things we can say. One of the things that should be obvious to you, but it's kind of a joy when you look at cities or visit cities, is that cities love technology, right? So every technology that was ever invented often was invented in cities, like writing or how we tell time in the early cities. But more recently, the telephone, the telegraph, and of course the elevator, the car is used in a different way. But of course ICT, so information and communication technologies, are the technologies of our time. And they're really completely changing how cities work. But cities are also creating the environments that show us how to use these technologies in new ways, right? So the technologies are sort of tools, and how you use tools is what is important. They give us more scope, more possibilities. But, and so if you reflect, just even casually in any city about how people are using information and communication technologies, it's bewildering, right? Obviously, there's a lot of that in government and in management and in businesses, but a lot of it really is driven by people, by how we navigate space, how we interact with each other, how we meet, how we create culture, right? So that's kind of interesting. So if you take that from that perspective, so hold that idea for a moment, let's go back to 2008, which is more or less, I think, the time when IBM in particular came up with the Smarter Cities campaign, which tried to define the possibilities of these technologies to run cities in a different way. And at the time, if you go back a little bit, the conversation was very different from the conversation we're having here. And so that's important, that 14, 15 years later, we're having a very, very different conversation. We talk about equity and people and adaptive management. But then the objective was not that. It was really from engineering and corporations and local government to run the city sort of like a perfect machine, right? Like a mechanism of command and control. And this was tried actually in many cities. For example, in Rio during the Olympics, and more recently in a different version by Google in Toronto that never came to be, and so on. There are many examples. You'll be familiar with them. And in some sense, these continue to be interesting uses of these technologies, but they did not become the most important uses, right? So, so when you look at the uses of technologies and the concept of smarter cities in urban environments, there are basically two very different kinds of uses. And it's very important to keep it clear which one we're talking about. So one is still this concept of engineering, if you will, the concept of control, the fact that we want to run the transit system on time, we want to pick up trash on time, we want to know where the potholes are and fix them. And we can manage these sort of operations that are more or less routine, that happen every day, better, by having better information, by having sort of the city or sometimes a business actually use this to basically automate a control loop and have better situational information and operational information. That's still useful. And it's being used in many, many places now more invisibly. But the most important application almost, and the one that we're mostly discussing here so far, is really how technology becomes part of life, of business life, of the markets that make up cities, but also of cultural and civic life. And in this is much more what Rajiv was reminding us. I remember being also in India at the time. I think Obama just visited, I don't know when that was, but it was when the Smarter Cities initiative was announced, and we were just reflecting a little bit offline on that. And I remember thinking, I think I tweeted, you know, India is ready for smarter cities, but are smarter cities ready for India? And the question is, you know, if you've been to an Indian city, you know it's very complex. And mostly it works because people make it work, because all kinds of low businesses and things make it work. And so we're talking about what that is in a city. And in that respect, these technologies, what they create are all these signals, all these channels by which people and businesses and civic organizations can self-organize. So this is not a structure of command and control. It's an emergent structure that can be adaptive because people have better information, because they're sharing some of that information and finding ways to act collectively in different modes, economic, civic, social, in order to do that. And I think that's what we're exploring. Now, when you look at that, and you see the recent history of how these technologies, particularly through corporations, came into cities, there's a lot of distrust of technology that came with that. When you look at the share economy, for example, with transportation, or something like Airbnb, this has created enormous disruptions in cities. Some of them good, they needed to happen. But a lot of them that created very expensive housing, that eroded public transportation, and that did a bunch of things that we're not really ready for. And so we're right now trying to recover a little bit from that and find a model that has more balance, that allows businesses to be disruptive, but creates cities that are good for all, and that at the same time allows us to imagine different futures with better knowledge and better management of information. So that's the challenge, and it's where equity, sustainability, and so on come in. But it's very important when you think about these are open-ended problems that will require invention, collaboration, imagination. So it's less the command and control structures of the early IBM years, and it's more a rich ecology of information that allows us to be inventive together and to work for the public good. There's no prescription to do that. So the role of cities and the role of technology providers is much more constructive. It's more like creating a platform, but it's also a platform that's not mostly for business. It's for civics, and it's for imagination into the future. So that, I think, remains the challenge for smarter cities, and that's what we are.
I think we live in an and world. We want to have our cake and eat it. So with that as backdrop, I think I'll move on to Jacques, and maybe you can help us understand, you know, where the role of technologies come in, and how do we achieve this end world where it's not just about command control, it's about adaptiveness. It's not just for the businesses, but it's also for the people.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I think the topic has been raised several times. I would like to go back to it, is the topic of the role of cities and how do they prepare to challenges, whether it's a COVID pandemic or climate change, for example. And Mr. Mayer, you raised that point earlier, and I would fully subscribe to what you said about the need for preparation. I would argue that the concept of smart city is not a modern concept. I mean, in Europe, maybe the Roman Empire was already talking about smart city, even if they didn't name it like that. They were using technology that at that time might have been water drainage, right? Which is still an issue in many cities today. But But the difference between that period and now is probably, of course, the acceleration of time and therefore the need for greater agility of cities. And I would like just to share an experience. I mean, the company I work with, Dassault System, when the COVID crisis started, tried to react and see how we could help national governments, local cities face that crisis. And what we noticed is that I would say 95% of our interlocutors, the people we were trying to speak to, were saying, that's very interesting, but we don't have time. Because they were trying to extinguish a fire. They didn't have time to understand how technology could help them extinguish the fire. What I mean by that is the value, the power of what we call virtual twin technology, digital twin, is much more, I think, in the design phase, in the planning phase, than the actual operation. The smart cities today are very much on the operation, which is normal. They want to better operate the city of today. Now, the real question, I think, is how you can design and plan those cities so that they operate in a virtuous way, whether it's to face a pandemic or whether it's to face climate change. This perception of this strategy for cities comes directly from our own experience as a company. For the past 40 years, we've been working developing virtual twins of objects in the manufacturing industry. And when it comes to climate change or how do you decarbonize manufacturing industry, what we have noticed is that the greatest potential in decarboning is actually in the design of objects, not in improving the way you operate them. Well, I think exactly the same applies to cities. Virtual twins is a technology, whether it's 3D modeling, 3D simulation, data analytics, is a technology that can help you better operate the city, but it most importantly helps you to better design and plan the city to face all those challenges.
So it's really looking at the entire engineering life cycle, from planning, design, construction, and then operate and maintain. Okay, last but not least, Man Leong, your perspective, please.
Yeah, thanks. You know, if not for anything else, I think this COVID period, when the world practically actually stood still, has shown actually how far behind cities are actually behind in terms of fighting and mitigating the impact of climate change. You know, I think if you look backwards, over the last 2 years, the world stood still, right? Traffic slowed down drastically, airports ground to a halt, ports slowed, and the air around cities actually cleared. Some of us probably remember the picture where citizens in Delhi were able to see the Himalayas for the first time, right? And so it was quite obvious that during this period, the world slowed down, but yet we barely put a dent on the growth of emissions. It's quite clear. And in fact, right now, we are seeing the emissions going back on the upward track. So that is the challenge we are dealing with. And I don't need to mention to you about all the extreme occurrences of extreme weather that we all see, right? So this gets to the crux of the issue. If cities actually occupy only 3% of the land surface, and it's going to be accountable for, say, over 3/4 of the emissions, then we get to this particular issue, which I think one of the speakers at the panel yesterday was also saying that, you know, today the dynamic is that cities, the more competitive the city, the higher the emission. And the real issue that we got to deal with is really how to turn this key dynamic on its head. And I think in the go forward, the key issue is really for how cities are going to figure out driving down their own carbon footprint so that they can actually become more competitive, more resilient, and afford better quality of life. Citizens know that, and they certainly demand so. And I would also want to say that there is now opportunity actually for the cities to show leadership, to see how they can actually apply technology and also leveraging digitalization to basically make their cities more sustainable and of course move towards the net zero targets as quickly as possible. And this is also something I learned from WCS just yesterday. The city of Helsinki, and this is really interesting, the city of Helsinki has set themselves a net zero target for the year 2030. Not 2050, not 2040, 2030. And that's how ambitious they have actually put themselves to be. So I think the opportunity is here, and we've got to ask ourselves how we're going to leverage on digitalization going forward. Yeah.
So a smart city must be a green city as well. Okay, I'm going to transition to the next segment, and I'm going to dwell on the topic that I think Jacques, you mentioned, Louis, you mentioned, which is smart city is really not new, right? It has been here, but from my perspective, I think technologies that are prevalent and rapidly maturing today, from the cloud to the AI to the Web3, will actually present new possibilities. At the same time, I think open up the realms where cities are no longer maybe bound by just the physical infrastructure that we see today. So I'll first start with a question to this side of the table, right? With Man Leong and then to Jacques. Is this time different? Is this time different that now smart cities are really here, right? And what opportunities do you see and potentially what roadblocks? So Man Leong, you want to start first?
Well, I just maybe carry on from what I just mentioned. I think the opportunity is here for cities to show leadership in application of technology, especially digitalization. I would say I would recommend them to look at how they can actually digitalize more extensively their assets, their critical infrastructure, their transportation system, in order to drive, I think, their movement towards sustainability goals that they set for themselves. And why I say so, because digitalization actually helps to give visibility. Digitalization, if done well, will give visibility over a city's critical assets, flow. And when I say flow, I talk about people, transport, energy, information. And now, visibility over carbon footprint. And what do you do with all this visibility in the first place? Well, when you actually have real-time visibility of your assets, then you are possibly able to actually unlock, I think, choke points so that you can take better interventions to basically unlock all these choke points and drive up the city's efficiency, especially in terms of use of energy. And the visibility that is afforded by the digitalization, which basically gives useful trends and data, will help the city to determine whether there's any kind of disruption occurring at the local level or maybe at a global level, and therefore prompting, I think, cities to take interventions to stem the impact of those disruptions. But I think the biggest impact that's likely to come is when you have a view of the carbon footprint. It helps the city to determine where the emissions are the most intense, and then figure out how we can work with the community and the industry partners actually to drive down essentially the carbon footprint through, I think, more decisive action. So I think the opportunity is here. The opportunity is really here for the cities to see how they can leverage on technology, leverage on digitalization, partner essentially with the technology companies to basically drive down the overall carbon footprint, up the game in terms of the movement towards sustainability goals. And I say again, it's quite clear that today the citizens are aware and they demand it too.
Yeah, I think energy transition has to be a science-based approach. I think it starts with having visibility through the data, as you said. Jacques?
Opportunities and roadblocks. Regarding opportunities, I think the question here behind is, why should a mayor of a city invest in these technologies? What is the return on investment of
I'll ask him that right
a
right
virtual twin? And I would say for a local authority today, investing in a virtual twin presents at least two opportunities. One is what I would call the return on sustainable investment, right? Because I don't think a city can address sustainable issues without that kind of technology today. If you take, for example, mobility issue in a city is not the sole responsibility of the transportation department. It is the responsibility of the transportation, the schooling, the business development, the safety, the energy system, whatever. So, and you cannot address mobility as a transverse issue if you do not create a virtual twin of your city that enables all these stakeholders to work around a common referential, to speak the same language. Otherwise, you are just reproducing a siloed organization. Virtual twin kills the silo organization. It's transversal, and it gets everybody to work together. So I think that is the first return on investment to face these sustainability issues. I think the second return on investment, which I would think, I'm not a politician myself, but I think it speaks a lot to mayors, is a return on political investment. Is that this same virtual twin is actually going to help political leaders communicate, engage with citizens. With a virtual twin, you can explain the existing city, and you can actually show what the city will look like once you transform the city. That is a what-if scenario. What happens if we transform the city this way? Well, with 3D modeling, 3D simulation technology, you can actually do that and visualize the city of the future, which I think is an extremely powerful tool to communicate with citizens. So I think these are the opportunities offered by technology. Now, when it comes to roadblocks, I would say that two major, and they're related to what I've just said. The first one is, call it digital maturity or digital immaturity. To build a virtual twin, you need data and you need skilled people. And that's the core thing on which I think cities should work. And the second roadblock is sometimes lack of political leadership. You need political leadership to implement a virtual twin. A virtual twin is not a solution for technicians. It is, but it's also a political solution that has to transform completely the way cities operate. And for that, you need political leadership.
I really like what you said, which is actually it enables an ecosystem of collaboration. And I think that's probably what's different this time, if you like. Maya, I'm going to ask you that question. Is it worth investing after listening to Jacques? And also the fact that we are really looking at a different set of technologies that would change the way we plan cities. Do you see that taking place? Because in the near future, you may even, beyond these things that we talk about, you may even have to meet your residents in the metaverse. So many things are changing. How is that impacting city planning?
So I received so many advices for mayors and politicians, and actually I'm totally agree. So we have to invest because we don't have choice, actually. Yes, political perspective, sometimes it's only 4 years before next election, but we cannot talk about a 4-year perspective. And of course, we can talk also about two choice what we have, like very quick and fast, and or slow and fast, and this is world war, and slow, and this is climate changes. So we just can choose what is our end. But I see, as I said before, that also cities have a very important role to not do this choice. And it means that we have to be ready for crisis and for the operative reaction, but in the same time, we need to have a long-term conception of city development. So, and of course, crisis, it is also challenges and new possibilities. So in Europe now, maybe is the most biggest challenge. This is energy crisis. So we don't have energy. We don't have gas. We know we have one big country with gas, but there is some problems, as we know. What to do? What to do, for example, for so small country as Estonia? So there is only one possibility: new technology. Okay? Wastewater energy, sea water energy, solar energy. So it needs investments, but when we have gas, we don't do those investments. But now we don't have choice. And in the same time, this is a green transformation, because wastewater and seawater and of course solar energy, this is green energy. And we have to invest not because this is green, but because in the future we don't have any other source of energy. And if we talk about this digital twin, so this is a possibility to change the way of thinking also for politicians, to start to think more conceptual, to have big vision, to have future perspective, not 4 years, but 10, 20 years. Yes, today we have to deal with crisis. Today, this moment. But in the same time, we have to think about the future. Because future is now.
Is indeed. I think we have to think longer term because cities are here forever, even though human attention, political cycles are very short term. And I think that's probably something Singapore can relate to, how we think about, shoring up our shoreline in the event of flooding. And we think 100 years. So that's how long term it could be. Sanjeev, I want to come to you and actually get your perspective as well in terms of how city planning will change or has been changing because of all these forces that we talk about, including technology.
So let me tell you the problem we have. We have India is a large country anyway, and it's urbanizing at an absolutely manic pace. Over the next 25 odd years, we'll be absorbing something like 300 to 350 million people into urban India. Some of it will be old cities expanding. There'll be new cities. What are now rural areas will get urbanized. All kinds of messy things will happen. And it's happening whether we like it or not. It's happening outside of government control in many ways because it's just happening so fast. Now, this is also, remember, that legacy systems in some cases don't exist or simply incapable of keeping up with this expansion. So what do you do under this situation? So this is the context in which this digital twin idea is quite attractive because from what I have understood of it, digital twins using satellite and other digital information, a rough and ready digital twin can actually be rolled out reasonably quickly. I've, in fact, next door had a chat with one of the entrepreneurs there, and he showed me how he had managed to do one for Bangalore in 3 or 4 weeks using satellite photographs, just digital twin. Now, why is that important? Because once I have a base case, and assuming that it's dynamic enough to keep expanding, first of all, just to keep track of what is on the ground. Very often we have no idea what the situation on the ground is. The map we have and so on are outdated. Where we thought was a field of wheat is actually already a condominium, and it's already well inside the city, and so on. And then once we have that, we can overlay or underlay that with the amenities, pipelines, and so on. Those pipelines are getting laid down, but very often nobody knows where they are. One department knows, and then a few weeks later they are digging it up, same place up again to set the metro line in. So all of this confusion, literally the only hope we have is to create a digital twin that is dynamic and we can keep track of it. So not a concept we have used in India in any meaningful way here, but we can see that given the lack of any legacy systems and the speed at which it is all evolving, this may well be, if it works, it's a big if still, but I can see that it could be something that may be very, very helpful for us. First of all, just to keep track of what's happening now. But of course, then we can also begin doing simulations of what kind of impact certain changes may have. I mean, of course, we live in a world of unintended consequences, but at least we have some sense of the range of possible outcomes, first of all. And even if there are unintended consequences, some of them could be good unintended consequences, not always bad. But we'll be able to track it very early on so that we can head off bad unintended consequences and encourage good ones. So all of this suggests to me that a digital twin is definitely something we are interested in. In fact, I was talking to Dasu earlier before this and said, let's try this in one large city and see what happens. It just, even if you do it for a sizable area, you would get interesting outcomes. I mean, before I end, I'll just give you one example of how this could be applied. Delhi did not have a metro system till 15 years ago. Now it has the world's third largest metro system and is growing so fast, it'll probably go past the top 2 quite quickly as well. Now, as you can imagine, this has changed the city in multiple ways. We ourselves don't understand how it has happened. In certain areas, densification has happened in an unauthorized way. People are walking, are using those stops, but for what they do at the last mile is unknown. And of course, our entire bus system is now running in exactly the wrong way, because it's uncorrelated to the new metro system we have created. So there are many bus routes which are empty, and there are other bus routes that are now full, but they don't correlate to the new metro system we have created. Now, if I had to physically change each one of these bus routes one by one, we would go crazy. Again, this is clearly something where a good simulation using AI would clearly help us a lot. And we can do the same thing with walking paths and all kinds of other outcomes. Yeah.
I think the word that comes to my mind is leapfrog, right? This gives you the
Absolutely.
opportunity to do so at a
Yes.
scale that's unimaginable.
Absolutely. We get to apply this to something like 500, 600 million people.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. I'm going to have Uwish kind of round up this question for us, right? In terms of how you've heard examples from Jacques, from Sanjeev, from the mayor. So how will city planning change from this point forward?
So I think we see before our eyes that city planning is changing a lot. And just to pick up on your initial question for this round, I think every time is different in a city. And this time, obviously, we have a better sense of where we want to go in terms of dealing with all these crises, but also creating green cities that are sustainable, that go through an energy transition on the other side. And we know how much time we have, right? We have a couple of decades, maybe. So it's fundamentally different in that way, that we're looking ahead with a general set of requirements. This is sometimes called backcasting, that we have objectives for the future and we're working towards them without knowing exactly how to do it. But this is kind of a new kind of thing, and it's guiding the kind of planning that's different from before, where we set a master plan and we zone and put everything in their place. Instead, we have these more abstract goals, and we have to work towards them, presumably in very different ways than with master planning. But now I want to pick up on this line of conversation about uses of technologies and planning in a slightly more specific way. So I think we've been dancing around this issue of how much can we actually create sort of a big model of the city, whether it's a digital twin or something else. Again, these models are old in some ways. They've been very useful in transportation planning. Just Rajiv was also reflecting on that as an example. They've been around for 30, 40 years. Tokyo has a huge one that's a marvel. LA has a different one, more about traffic. But these have been useful in that context very much. But I want to introduce, being an academic, I'm the least practical person here, but I try to think about what are the fundamental things that we can do and that we cannot do with certain approaches. So I want to just introduce an idea to you, just very briefly, which is, I call it the planner's problem, the problem that a planner has. So a lot of you will be planners, so this is your most important problem. You have to be aware of it. It's a bit like playing chess or Go, right? You're familiar with the game. So it's much easier, I'm going to go with chess, forgive me, I know it a little bit better. It's much easier to describe the board. I can show you what the situation of the game is at some point, and you know where the pieces are, and then you have to decide what your next move is towards, say, winning, right? So you're familiar with that. But it's much harder to play the game to win than it is to describe the board. Why is that? Because there are many possibilities for the game to unfold. In fact, if you start asking how many possibilities are there, they're exponential, they're enormous. And this is just a board, right, with 8 by 8. So this is called computational complexity. And it means that in most interesting systems, when you run them forward and ask, what could they become? They have essentially an infinite number of possibilities. So you can describe them as they are. If you look at data rates today and you measured every person, 10 times a second in each place, you can actually handle those flows to create a digital model, a digital twin model of a city. That's the board, the chessboard. But if you ask, what will the city become in the future, then all this complexity of all the possible moves by all the possible agents comes into play. And that is essentially impossible to keep track and optimize. That's the planner's problem. That you should not try to optimize a complex system because you will simplify it and you'll forego a lot of possibilities. So these technologies have to be used right. And that means that they can give you situation awareness and run certain relatively simple and repetitive systems like transportation. But then for development and planning, they have to be used in a generative way as a platform, as keeping you informed, keeping the data refreshed and so on, so they know what's going on, but not as a prescriptive tool that eliminates a lot of possibilities. And that's the challenge. So the planners problem is very important, and it's very important that these technologies don't become, again, the command and control that already the first generation of technologies have created, and in some sense, I think, have been proving not so useful. So I think when you think about it this way, there's also sort of an incremental way in which a lot of this data and technology can come in. And I want to reflect again, whether it's India or looking at South Asia or other parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia where we are here, or Africa, these are the places where the sustainability transition will be most difficult, because they're the places where cities have less access to technology and trained people, to your point, but also where the cities are growing the most, and where we need to urbanize and develop cities that create services and expand energy usage, in fact, but where we have to do it in a way that's sustainable so that global climate change doesn't come to hit us all. And so that really requires a lot of international collaboration and probably incremental uses of data that take us to better and better uses for management, but also for self-organization. And so we need to use these technologies well, not just in prescriptive ways. And that's, I think, the most important lesson of the last 20 years.
I completely agree. So for simple answers, things can be automated. For issues that's still evolving, it's really a platform, a coordination point, and a way for people to work collaboratively easier than in the past. So I'm
Can I add to that?
Oh,
because
please,
I really agree with what Luis has said, and also, I mean, there's very little to disagree on this panel, as with most panels, right? That technology is important and all that. But I think if I can just maybe offer three axioms that came up on my mind, right? One is that I think the technology exists out there for many solutions, but it is usually not the main issue. Many of the problems are really political, organizational, social, and that makes it much more complex. I know he described a chessboard, but really a chessboard is not so complex in the sense that you can actually, IBM and Deep Blue and machines can actually work out all the different combinations, whereas in the city you can't. So that's one. Technology is really not the issue here. And I sometimes worry that we are not asking the right questions, but we jump to the answer straight away. And we see that a lot which leads me to a second point, which is that planners don't have all the answers, or government people don't have all the answers all the time. And as in any complex system, you can't overplan things. You can plan, you have agency, you can influence how a city is planned, but you should be very careful. And I always remember one of my first bosses told me, first do no harm, because you can actually do a lot of harm with some of the rules you set and some of the plans you set. And the tendency of the planner, which is the third thing, is that we try to deliver comprehensive solutions. And what Man Leong talked about in terms of visibility, I mean, this is a planner's dream, right? Achieve full visibility on the whole city so that I can anticipate any issues. I can scenario plan every scenario. Really, this is what all planners dream about. But actually, in our own experience, it is better, we think it is better not to try to accomplish everything, but take a much more human-centered approach, find out what are the real problems to be solved, and just prosecute them directly, right? So simple things, right? We had this experience in some of the apps that we built as well. Take, for example, one of the apps we built called Live SG, which in its initial concept talked about how we want Singapore government, in a sense, to transact with citizens through a portal, through every significant moment of their lives. And so in a sense, it became a super app. But actually, where it gets most traction is if we find one particular use case and we go deep in it and we solve real problems for citizens. So the one problem that we've actually done really well in is in terms of just helping citizens register their birth, sorting out all the administrative workload there. And I think that's just a small story about how usually, it's not the grand solutions that matter, but the simple solutions that matter. A lot of us talked about how we need to communicate our citizens more. Many governments spend a lot of money on your Facebooks, Instagrams. You know, every politician will have a Facebook and Instagram page, right? But actually, one of the most effective ways we communicate to citizens, at least what we've noticed in our government, is not just through the mainstream media, but actually through simple posters or displays at our public housing lift landings. And because technology is now in fashion, instead of a paper poster, now we have digital displays where you can actually flash digital information. You can actually create a connectedness with the neighborhood, because through these displays, you can tell people about who's the cleaner who's been cleaning your place. You can tell people about offers in their nearest coffee shop or supermarket. Simple solutions like that communicate messages better, create a lot more potential for solutions, interesting solutions, rather than big, massive projects.
That's a very good segue to the question that I actually want to ask you. So we talk about human-centered approach and really addressing the needs of the people in the city. So the question I want to ask is really that smart cities also has to be inclusive. And therefore, how do we make sure that as we progress, we bring the population along?
Yeah. So this is a big passion and also a big worry of ours on how do we make sure that everyone's digitally included. Because actually a smart city can be really, really daunting for our citizens. I think every country here today, Singapore, I guess, it's been in the news. Well, take for example, scams, right? Many of you would have received a scam phone call pretending to be the Ministry of Health for COVID quarantine, or a scam SMS on saying that you haven't paid your taxes, please go pay your taxes. And many people have lost money on that. And you can imagine how daunting it is. My mother-in-law, she just recently upgraded to a smartphone simply because there are no longer all these feature phones available. And she will never do online banking because it's too daunting for her. And these are the people that I think could be excluded as we move more and more of services online, as we become more digitized. Even today, if you look at public transport systems, for example, it is very daunting for someone who's carrying a walking stick or who's, who finds it a bit harder to walk, to actually navigate. And it's quite confusing, right? Because things move really fast. And I think that's one thing that cities and us, people in government, have to contend with. How do you actually design for the extreme user so that you can continue to make services accessible and available without holding the rest of the city back? So I sit on the board of a bank here in Singapore, and one of the things which is really front and center in our minds, right, in terms of even looking at bank branches, because we used to have bank branches in every neighborhood center, but actually if you talk about the future of banking, most of us who are young and able, in a sense, do all our banking online. In fact, hardly ever visited a bank branch in the last 3 to 5 years. But actually, there are a whole host of the elderly and people who are not comfortable with online banking that actually still queue up or still want to go to a bank branch. And so every time you close down a bank branch, yes, I'm going to save operational efficiency. And if I take the 80-20 rule, maybe I just focus on where the money is, and 20% of the people, they just have to find some other ways. That's not the way to operate, right? If you really want to be inclusive. So one thing which they did to leverage technology was to replace some of these physical branches with actually tele-bankers. So you no longer need a physical person there, but basically you can do almost 100% of the transactions you could do. Except that now, because you have that, you can actually centralize everyone in a call center, and then you can continue to serve people. It's the same thing for government services today. If you look at, there are appointments and there are queues in whether it's collecting passports, whether it's the CPF, but we've steadily optimized them over time, such that actually, while most people will find it most convenient to do everything online, they can also do the same kinds of services in person, and it is no bother because actually we try to streamline the entire process. I think that's the way inclusion has got to be thought of. So we really have to design for the extreme user and we have to think very hard about not just the median, but really the people at the end.
I think citizen services or public service really is for everyone and for all spectrums, and therefore there's a lot of consideration. Mayor, I want to ask the same question to you. How do you make cities accessible to all? And what are some of the experiences you have in Estonia for that?
So I think it's very important to understand that public sector actually doesn't have enough competence. It's also crisis showed it that private sector sometimes have more competence and faster action. So it means that if we want to do the science-based decisions, we have to cooperate with private sector, with the university, but also with companies. So it's true, we don't have enough competence. So, but in the same time, cities can be platform for the new technologies, new services, and new products. So we can give this opportunity to the companies to test the new products and new services before they enter to the global market, test it in the city level. So, and this is also a good opportunity for the city. So, and if talk about communication with the citizens, of course, pre-communication is always better. So good decisions need to be explained. And it means that this is very important for the local authorities to have contact with the citizens and everyday contact. So, and also, of course, technologies give this possibility. So, and in the future, we see that competence of the people is growing. So we have competence not only in university. Every person, every citizen have enough competence to share it with authorities. And the question is how to use this potential. I believe that in future, it's not only technology. Future is more involvement of the people in the decision-making process. So this is also give to the people understanding that they're also responsible for the future. If people and citizens have more knowledge about technologies, so their wishes are also in the higher level. And it is better and easier to discuss with citizens the future perspective.
So really, it's public-private partnership. It's also using cities as living labs to encourage innovation. And innovation does not just have to come from top down, but also bottom up, and to engage the community and get them involved and own, I guess, some of the issues that we want to solve together. With that, I'm going to actually give the audience a chance to ask some of your questions. I'm starting to see questions coming up. Let me see. I'm going to ask the first one that shows up right now, and I will ask the questions first, then we'll decide who wants to address it. So with trust of government an issue for some parts of the world, how can we balance the more extensive use of data to create smart cities and privacy concerns? So it's something that we did talk about, right? How with the evolution of technology, with the awareness of citizens, people are more aware of how their data are being used. And then yet at the center of it, data, as I quote Sir Nigel Shepard, who was here, is the feedstock for innovation. So how do we balance that? So Louis, you look like you want to answer. Maybe I give you that first question first.
Sure, I'll try to get us started with that. It's obviously a very important question. At the moment, we feel in general that we're out of balance, that a lot of the uses of data, in fact, the way data services have been introduced by a lot of the mostly big tech companies have been in some sense a model that's somewhat exploitative, right? That you get something that feels that's free, but then it's servicing you either ads or using your information for sale. And that kind of feels like it's a contract that you don't have a choice to undertake under different situations. I think there are a number of cities and national governments all over the world trying to find better terms for that. In the European Union, this is a very important issue, and I think also in parts of Asia. But it doesn't feel like we have a solution at the moment. I think that going to the issue of trust specifically, I think there's a saying that trust is consistent performance over time, right? So that if you know that if you share data, say with your local government or even with a business that's engaged in providing you the service, you feel you get a benefit from that interaction, right? And you're not just being extracted. And so that's very important. I think local governments, particularly around basic functions and services that are essential for people, particularly more vulnerable people, have a role in showing, demonstrating that sharing certain information, for example, this came up a lot with COVID, who were the vulnerable populations, who needed assistance like food or water, particularly elderly populations, for example. Then people feel that if those are delivered and they work, then there's a sense that there is trust. It's worth sharing information because, the government is there to help you and so on. But that loop of not just sharing the information, but seeing how it's used and for people feeling that there's a benefit for that to happen is really the critical part. And that doesn't develop immediately. The first step usually often is to share the information. And then the question is what happens next. So again, there's an opportunity to do much better. And I think we've just started to explore this. On the issue just quickly of equity, this is an issue where, people-centric planning. This is an issue that really is transformational in planning, right? We used to do planning from a bird's eye view, just looking at particularly the physical shape of the city and its systems. But now we're asked in some sense to do planning from the perspective of an individual, right? So this is kind of almost upside down, right? And it feels like it's very subjective. How could you do this? How could you know, from the perspective of a person, what the city should look like? But I think the way it's used, the way it works, is that if you take particularly the perspective of particularly someone who may be more vulnerable, either a new migrant or a child or an elderly person or for example, the perspective of gender, Maimuna Sharif yesterday said something that sums it up, which is basically that, for example, in terms of gender, if you ask, is a city safe for women? If it is safe for women, it's also safe for men, she said. So, and I think it's probably true. And, if a city is good for elderly in terms of support, it's probably also good for other people. So it becomes an entry point, a perspective that you may not have considered traditionally, but that allows you to create not only an environment that's better tailored for populations that have been disadvantaged or that are new, et cetera, but then by establishing a higher standard, you actually create cities that are good for everybody. So this is kind of a motor for finding new solutions that allow you to consider perspectives that didn't exist before. And I think this, particularly from the point of equity and cities that remain open, that can renew themselves, they incorporate young people and immigrants and traditionally populations that have been disadvantaged, that becomes transformational for planning. Again, it's an ongoing experiment that we're trying to figure out how to do really in planning and policy.
I like that. So if it works for the smaller segments of the population, it will generally work for the rest. Okay, I have a question for Maya. It's a difficult one. It says, building a digital twin of a city is an ambitious target for most mayors. How would you suggest mayors can achieve a positive progress towards such target? First of all, maybe do you subscribe to this, concept of using technologies to build a digital twin? And if you do, what advice would you give the audience in this forum? Maybe what I'll do is I will ask Jacques for this perspective first, and then you can add on, because I know Jacques, you would have a perspective, right? How would you suggest to mayors that they should embark on this? And then I'll have mayor respond as well.
Well, I'm not sure I'm here to give advice to mayors. I wouldn't dare to.
He will validate.
But at least I can tell you what are the discussions we've been having with mayors, what are the hurdles, the roadblocks that may have happened, and I touched upon that earlier. I think one first obstacles that mayors often find is fighting their own administration, either because their own administration has already started to develop a solution, the in-house home-cooked solution.
Yes.
That might be good, but might not necessarily address all the needs. And then when you have external existing solutions that exist and that are proposed, and often we get the answer, oh yeah, but it's too late, we've already started doing something. I think having a broad view of existing solutions and without getting entangled into a home-cooked solution initially, that would be a first reaction that I would have to your question. The second one that is key is everything around the data, getting the data ready, clean, to be used in the digital twin. You can have the nicest virtual twin solution. If you don't have the data, it's like having a Ferrari without anything to put inside to have it to drive it, right? We talked about training the people, but again, I would insist on the very last point, which I mentioned briefly earlier, which is political leadership. Adopting a virtual twin or a digital twin solution is not only technology. It is a profound transformation of the way the organization, the administration, the city works. I'll give you one example. And that's it's a multi-administrative level example that happened in France. During the COVID crisis, one of the local authorities we spoke to was Région Grand Est. It's a big region in France, in the region of Strasbourg, in the east part of France. And they came to us very early saying, look, this COVID crisis is hitting. It was the first region hit by the pandemic. And the president of the region said, please help me, because I just can't understand what's happening on my territory. You were talking about understanding what's happening there. He said, I'm receiving raw data from the health ministry that I cannot just interpret it. I want to understand the speed at which the pandemic is spreading on the territory. So we said, okay, we've got technology for that. He said, can you do some predictive analysis? I said, yeah, okay. So we developed a model, epidemiologic model, that would actually predict how many people would go into intensive care units in hospitals 3 months ahead. But in order to do that and to have that system, that dashboard operate, we needed data, fresh data, to be injected into it every day. And the fact is that data was controlled by the National Health Ministry. And so there was a political fight between the national level and the local level. The national level is saying it's not your responsibility. This is a national pandemic. And the local level saying, guys, if you want us to do something, we need the data. Because of that fight, we lost 3 months. So that's why I go back to this political leadership. You can have the best technology, but if you don't have the data, because you don't have the political leadership, you can't do it.
Okay, I'm going to get the mayor to wrap this up, and then I've been warned we need to wrap up. So, Mayor, any response, any feedback or reaction to what Judge said about adopting technologies for city development? And I know Estonia is actually very progressive in this field.
So I have one example about organizing the transportation in town cities. So we have here one example from India. So how to collaborate different lines of transport, like metro and buses. But actually, mobility question is more large than only public transportation. So to organize the mobility system in the city, we have to collect so many data. Behavior of citizens, type of roads, different types of public transport. So we have to understand what of the choices of the people, where to want to go, where they work, where they study, where they live. So it's huge data and very different type of data. So, and this data gives the possibility to create a mobility model, mobility transportation model. This model can give us possibility to create the conception of transportation, not only calibrate different lines of public transportation. Well, by the way, public transportation is in Tallinn is free of charge. We have free public transportation in Tallinn, but but in the same time, people are happy with our public transportation. They say that it's in a good level, but it's not popular because people want to use their private cars. So how to change their behavior, how to change their preference. So for those decisions, we need also data, because this is quite a difficult system, but we understand that it's possible, that data help us to change also behavior of the people. Of course, and again, I see this is also the future, how to create a new transportation model in Tallinn. So we start, but we see that it's a very big challenge in the future.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining me today. I think it's very clear cities play a role in these multiple disruptions that we live in. But at the same time, cities are here to serve the people, and therefore the whole intent of what the city services are meant to be has to be at the center of what we do. So please join me in thanking this panel, and thank you for your participation and your attention.
Thank you very much, panelists and moderator, for the exciting discussion. We have come to the end of the session. May I please invite all panelists and moderator to remain on stage for a photo, please. Could you stand up? Audience are now welcome to visit the Smart Cities Expo booth and Singapore Pavilion, which are open till 6 p.m. Do catch the next session, Future Cities Track, here in the same room. And for those who wish to attend the Urban Resilience Track in Sands Ballroom A and B, exit onto the left facing the stage. The next session will begin in about 10 to 15 minutes. Also, playbacks of this plenary will be available in our virtual conference from 10th August. Please scan the QR code on the screen for more information about the virtual conference. Finally, please use the QR code to fill in our feedback form for this session in WCS 2022. Thank you very much and see you all in 10 minutes.